The forest remembered everything. Old roads swallowed by root and mud, stone walls built by hands long dead now lost beneath decades of blackberry vine and fallen pine. Rusted farm tools half buried in soil so dark it looked like it had never seen sun. The Vermont woods did not forget. They simply waited the way old things wait, patient and silent, and certain that eventually everything abandoned would find its way back to them. On the coldest night of that October, the forest decided to hide two girls instead. 12-year-old Alexandra Calloway held her little sister's hand so tightly that her knuckles had gone white an hour ago and she hadn't noticed. Emmy was 7 small for her age and she had stopped complaining about her wet shoes sometime after midnight. That silence worried Alex more than the crying had. Emmy only went quiet like this when she was too exhausted to be afraid anymore. When fear had used itself up and left behind something simpler and harder, the animal instinct to keep moving and trust the person holding your hand. The rain had slowed to a drizzle, but the cold had deepened. Alex could feel it moving through her jacket, through the thin flannel shirt beneath it, settling into her ribs like something that intended to stay. She kept walking. She didn't know exactly where they were going. She only knew the direction away and the reason, which she held in her chest like a coal, small and burning, and keeping her moving when her legs wanted to stop. They were not going to be separated. That was the only thing that mattered. 3 days earlier, they still had a grandmother. Edna Calloway had been 71 years old and had lived in the same white clapboard house on Millhaven Road her entire life. She woke before sunrise every morning without an alarm. She kept her kitchen the way some people keep churches clean. Quiet, purposeful, every object in its place for a reason that had been arrived at through years of use and not changed because there was no reason to change what worked. She made tea from loose leaves she kept in a blue tin beside the stove, and she hummed while she did it. Old songs with no names that Alex had heard so many times. They had become part of the sound of home itself, as much a part of the house as the creak of the third stair or the way the back door stuck in wet weather. Every night before she turned off the lamp in the hallway, Edna would stand at the door of the room where both girls slept and say the same thing she had said for as long as Alex could remember. As long as we stay together, we still have a home. Alex had never thought much about those words. They were just something Grandma said the way grandmothers say things, repeated and warm and slightly mysterious like a prayer, whose meaning you aren't old enough to understand yet. She thought about them now, walking through the dark woods with Emmy's hand in hers, and for the first time they felt less like comfort and more like instruction. Less like something said to soothe and more like something said to prepare. Edna had gone 3 days ago. Not slowly, not with warning. She had been standing at the kitchen counter slicing an apple when her heart simply stopped. Alex had been sitting at the table doing homework. The apple hit the floor before Edna did. Alex had been across the kitchen in 2 steps, and she had known the way children sometimes know things they have no business knowing, that her grandmother was already gone before she reached her. The stillness was too complete, the absence too immediate. The next hours were a blur of neighbors and phone calls, and a kind paramedic named Dennis who kept asking Alex questions she couldn't answer. Then came the officials, people with lanyards and clipboards and the particular kind of careful voice that adults use when they have already decided something and are only pretending to explain it. They move through the house with the quiet efficiency of people who have done this many times, cataloging and noting and making the kind of decisions that other people's grief does not slow down. They said there was no next of kin. Alex's mother had left when Emmy was 2 and had not been heard from since. Their father had never been part of the picture at all. Edna had been at the whole of it, and now Edna was gone. They said the girls would need to be placed. Temporarily, they said, until arrangements could be made. Alex had asked what arrangements meant. The woman who answered was named Lorraine Dreyer. She was somewhere in her 40s with hair the color of old ash and eyes that moved around the room while she talked like she was cataloging the furniture along with everything else. She wore a county lanyard and carried a bag that was too large and too organized, and she spoke in the voice of someone who had delivered this particular kind of news many times and had long since stopped feeling it land. Separate placements, Lorraine had said. There are capacity issues at the regional facility. Emmy will go to a family in Harwick. Alexandra will go to the youth residential center in Burlington. It's temporary. Everything is temporary at this stage. Emmy had not cried immediately. She had simply turned and buried her face in Alex's side and grabbed two fistfuls of Alex's jacket and held on with the particular strength that small children have when they are terrified, a grip that has nothing to do with size and everything to do with desperation, the grip of someone holding on to the last thing they know for certain. Alex had felt her sister shaking against her and had looked at Lorraine Dreyer over the top of Emmy's head and said nothing. There was nothing to say to a woman who used the word capacity like it applied to children. Like children were inventory. Like a 7-year-old who had just lost her grandmother was a logistical problem to be solved with adequate placement facilities. They had been given until morning. Lorraine had left a number on the counter and told Alex there were sandwiches in the bag she'd brought and that someone would be by at 8 o'clock. She said it would be easier if the girls were ready. She said this the way people say things they know are not true, but have found useful to say anyway. After the door closed, Alex stood in her grandmother's kitchen for a long time. The tea tin was still on the counter beside the stove. The apple Edna had been slicing was still in the bowl, going brown at the edges. The hallway lamp was on because no one had turned it off, and Alex didn't want to be the one to do it because turning off that lamp meant something she wasn't ready to mean yet. It meant acknowledging that the person who turned it on every evening and turned it off every night was not coming back to do either of those things again. Emmy fell asleep on the couch around 9, still in her clothes, still holding one end of their grandmother's wool blanket. Alex sat at the kitchen table and thought. She was 12 years old. She understood more than most 12-year-olds understood because Edna had raised her to pay attention, to read the room, to listen past the words to what wasn't being said, to notice details the way her grandmother noticed details, which was with the quiet precision of someone who had learned long ago that the small things were usually the important things, the things people said quickly and moved past, the things that didn't quite fit the story they were telling. She thought about Lorraine Dreyer's eyes moving around the room while she talked, not grieving, not even professionally sympathetic, cataloging. And then sometime around 10 o'clock she heard it. She had gone to the back window to look at the yard the way she sometimes did when she needed to think, because the old maple at the edge of the property had a shape she found steadying, wide and certain and patient, planted so long ago that it had become part of the landscape rather than something placed upon it. She was standing at the window when she heard the sound of a car on the gravel outside. Not an engine starting, an engine that had been idling quietly, parked at the edge of the driveway, and a voice coming through a phone on speaker in the front seat. Lorraine Dreyer had not left. Alex pressed herself to the side of the window frame and listened through the old glass that had always let in more sound than it should have. The voice on the phone was a man's voice. Low-clipped, the voice of someone accustomed to giving instructions rather than asking questions. Someone for whom other people's time was a resource to be managed rather than respected. "It's done," Lorraine said into the phone. "Both girls will be out by morning. The house will be empty." A pause, the man's voice in the land. "What about the deed situation?" Lorraine again. "There's no will filed with the county. The old woman handled everything herself, cash and handshake, the way her generation did. Without a registered heir, and with the estate in probate, the county can move to classify it as unclaimed. That takes time, but it's clean." The man, "How much time?" Lorraine, 6 weeks, maybe 8. A longer pause. Then the man said something that Alex would carry with her into the woods and through the cold, and for a long time after something, she would turn over in her mind the way you turn a stone in your hand, examining every surface of it. "Good. The Callaway land has been sitting there since 1967. I've been waiting for it to come clear since before you started at the county. Don't let some procedural thing mess it up. Get the girls placed and get out of that house." The car pulled out of the gravel drive a minute later. Alex stood at the dark window and didn't move for a long time. The old maple stood in the yard outside, wide and certain in the dark, its leaves mostly gone now, its shape unchanged by the season. She was 12 years old. She didn't know exactly what deed situation meant or what probate was. But she understood the shape of what she had heard the way you understand the shape of a storm, before you understand its particulars, by the feeling in the air, by the way everything suddenly fits together into a pattern that had been there all along. She understood come clear. She understood I've been waiting. She understood that Lorraine Dreyer was not just a woman doing her job. She was someone doing someone else's job, and the someone else wanted something that had belonged to Edna Calloway. Had been waiting for it since 1967. Alex went to the couch and looked at her sister sleeping. Emmy's mouth was slightly open. She had a small purple bruise on her shin from falling off her bike last week. She was 7 years old, and she had already lost more people than any 7-year-old should have to lose. And Alex was not going to be the next thing she lost. She was not going to be a separate placement in a facility with capacity issues 3 hours away. Alex made a decision that no 12-year-old should ever have to make. She went to the closet in the hall and got the old canvas backpack that had been her grandmother's. She packed the wool blanket because Emmy would need it more than anything else. She packed the last of the bread from the counter and the 2 apples from the bowl, brown edges and all, because wasted food was something her grandmother had never permitted, and old habits are the ones that hold in a crisis. She packed the small flashlight from the kitchen drawer and the box of matches her grandmother kept beside the stove, and a pair of wool socks that were too big for her, and $3.40 that had been in the clay dish by the door. She put on her heaviest jacket. She helped Emmy into hers without fully waking her, one arm at a time, the practiced way you dress a child who is half asleep and trusting you completely because you are the only stable thing in their world. Emmy stirred and murmured something and settled back without waking. She picked up the wool blanket from the couch and wrapped it around Emmy's shoulders and lifted her, all 42 pounds of her, and carried her to the back door. She did not turn off the hallway lamp on her way out. She left it burning the way her grandmother had left it every night of their lives, a small orange certainty against the dark. And she took her sister through the back door and into the cold Vermont night. The forest behind the Calloway property began at the edge of the yard, where the mowed grass gave way to high weeds, and then almost immediately to the first line of trees: white pine and sugar maple. Old growth, the kind of trees that had been standing so long, they had stopped being individual things and become a single dark fact about the landscape. A wall made of living wood and decades of patience. Alex had played in those woods her whole life. She knew the first quarter mile the way she knew the inside of the house, by feel, by memory, by the particular way certain trees leaned and certain paths dipped, and the sound the creek made when you were getting close to it. A sound like something quietly insistent, going where it needed to go regardless of what stood in the way. But that first quarter mile was the limit of what she knew. Beyond it, the forest became something different, larger, less interested in people. She carried Emmy until her arms gave out, which took longer than she expected, because the need to protect someone you love is a remarkable fuel. And then she set her down and took her hand and walked. Emmy woke gradually, the way she always did, not all at once, but in stages. Consciousness assembling itself methodically, the way Emmy assembled most things, each piece placed with care before the next was added. She found her feet. She found Alex's hand. She walked without being asked to explain why. She didn't ask where they were going. She asked once why they were outside, and Alex said they were going on a walk, and Emmy accepted this, the way younger children accept the explanations of older ones, not because they believe them entirely, but because the alternative, not believing, is lonelier than uncertainty. The rain started an hour in. Not heavy, just persistent, the fine cold rain that October in Vermont specialized in, the kind that found every gap in your clothing and settled there with the patience of something that has nowhere else to be. Alex kept them moving. She used the flashlight sparingly, battery conservation, her grandmother's voice said in her head. You don't use what you don't need to use. The beam swept the ground in front of them just long enough to identify footing, then went dark again. Emmy stumbled twice. The second time she didn't say anything, just found her feet again and kept walking with her hand in Alex's and her face pointed ahead into the dark. And Alex felt something tighten in her chest that was equal parts sorrow and fierce pride. Her sister was 7 years old, and she was walking into a forest in the rain at midnight without complaint, because she trusted the hand she was holding. That trust was the heaviest thing Alex had ever carried. They were more than a mile in when Emmy stopped. "Alex," she said, "I heard something." Alex stopped too. The forest had gone very quiet around them, in the way that forests sometimes do, not the absence of sound, but a different kind of sound, a held breath quality, like the trees were listening to something they hadn't heard in a very long time. Then she heard it, a long, low sound, hollow and resonant, not close but not far either. Not an animal exactly, more like wind moving through something metal. A vibration more than a noise felt through the soles of her wet shoes as much as heard through her ears. Emmy pressed closer. "What if wolves live here?" Alex didn't answer immediately because she was attending to something else. Under the metallic sound, under the steady drip of rain from the pine branches above them, there was a smell, faint but distinct and entirely out of place. Rust, wet iron, old wood treated with something petroleum-based machine oil, or creosote, something industrial, something that had no business existing in the middle of a forest that hadn't seen industry in decades. She lifted her face and found the direction of the smell the way her grandmother had taught her to find things, not by looking, but by being still and letting the information come to you. "Come on," Alex said. "This way." The ground changed beneath their feet before they saw anything. The soft give of moss and pine duff hardened into gravel. Small stones mixed with dark earth packed down deliberately, a surface that human hands had laid at some point with a specific purpose. Weeds had grown through it and leaves had covered it, but it was still there underneath, still purposeful, still pointing somewhere. Alex swept the flashlight in a slow arc. Rails. Old railroad tracks half buried in dead leaves and encroached by saplings that had grown up through the wooden ties over many patient years. The iron was so rusted it had gone the color of dried blood. Thick pads of moss covered the ties themselves in gray-green. The tracks disappeared in both directions into darkness and fog curving out of sight, as if they connected to somewhere that no longer existed on any current map. Emmy stared. Why would train tracks be here? Alex didn't answer. She was looking at something ahead of them, something that the fog and the pine trees had been concealing until they were almost upon it. A shape, large, motionless, dark against the darker dark of the forest behind it. She moved toward it. Emmy followed without being asked. The shape emerged from the mist in pieces. First, the broad, flat roof, beaded with rain, that caught the flashlight beam and threw it back in small, cold points of light. Then the long, straight sides streaked with rust in long, vertical lines, like something that had been weeping for a very long time. Then the detail resolved itself, peeling green paint in long, curling strips, a thick growth of vines climbing the far end as though the forest had been trying to absorb it for years. And near the door, cracked white lettering still barely legible through decades of weather and neglect. U.S. Mail. It was a railway mail car. One of the old ones, the kind they had used for sorting and transporting post when mail moved by rail when the train was the fastest and most reliable thing in the country. And the men who worked the mail cars sorted letters by hand while the engine moved through mountain passes and river valleys, delivering the written word from one life to another. This one had not moved in a very long time. The wheels were buried to their axles in mud that had hardened over many seasons into something closer to stone. Small birch trees had rooted themselves against the near side, their white trunks pressed flat against the rusted metal, as if listening to something inside. Emmy's voice was barely above a whisper. "Did people live here?" Alex moved to the door. The handle was iron-worn smooth by use, and then by decades of weather, and it resisted her first pull, then the second. On the third try, the rollers gave with a sound like something clearing its throat after a very long silence, and the door slid open 6 inches, then a foot enough for 2 cold and wet girls to slip through. She pushed Emmy through first, then followed. The smell hit her immediately, old wood and cold iron, and the particular dry, dusty smell of enclosed spaces that have been sealed for years and have long since finished being anything other than what the air inside them has always been. Not unpleasant, Not threatening, just old in a way that felt geological rather than merely historical. The smell of time that has settled. The interior was long and narrow. Wooden shelves ran along both walls, some collapsed at their ends, and leaning some still holding themselves upright by force of habit in the memory of purpose. Canvas mail sacks, stiff with age and mold, were piled on the floor and heaped in the corners like sleeping things. A wooden sorting counter ran down the center of the car, its surface warped and split by decades of temperature change. At one end, two small windows, both cracked, one broken entirely, covered by a sheet of bark that had blown in from outside and lodged itself into the frame. The flashlight moved over all of it, slowly finding edges and corners in the accumulated stillness of decades. Emmy did not say it was nice. She stood just inside the door for a moment and said nothing at all, and then she said it smells like pencils. It didn't particularly, but Alex understood what she meant. It smelled like things that had been used by people and then preserved by time, like the inside of an old-school desk or the back of a drawer that hadn't been opened in years. It smelled in some way she couldn't make precise, like somewhere that had once been taken care of, like a place that remembered being purposeful. Alex moved the flashlight toward the far end of the car. The curtains were there, heavy, the deep burgundy of old theater seats, their color buried under a layer of dust so thick the fabric had gone a uniform gray. They hung from a rod that had bent slightly at one end, but still held the cloth aloft by stubbornness alone. Alex crossed to them and tested the fabric between her fingers. Dense wool, the kind of material made by people who expected things to last and built accordingly. She pulled them down with one clean pull rod and all, and the dust erupted around her in a pale cloud. And Emmy sneezed 3 times in rapid succession, and then laughed once, a small surprise sound like she hadn't expected to laugh and wasn't entirely sure she'd meant to, but there it was. Alex wrapped one curtain around Emmy's shoulders. The shivering slowed almost immediately. Emmy looked down at the faded fabric pulled around her and pulled it tighter with both hands. "It's warm," she said softly. The warmth in her voice was not just about temperature. Alex allowed herself one full breath. The roof was sound. She could hear the rain on it now, steady and distant, separated from them by several inches of old riveted steel. The walls had gaps at their joints where the wooden paneling had pulled away from the frame over many years of expansion and contraction, but these were manageable. She had already begun thinking about how to address them. She turned back to the interior and began to look properly with the attention of someone assessing rather than merely observing. It was then that she found it. She had been moving toward the far wall, checking the shelves for anything useful, when the flashlight caught something on the wood paneling beside the sorting counter. She almost missed it. The light was at the wrong angle, and the carving was shallow, worn smooth by years of humidity and temperature change, until it was more texture than mark, something you would feel before you would see. She stopped. She brought the light closer and angled it until the shadows fell right. Letters, cut into the wood with something pointed and deliberate. Not graffiti, not the casual territorial marking of someone passing through. These were intentional, careful, made by someone who wanted them to last. EC, this will always be yours. 1967. Alex stood very still. E.C. Edna Calloway. She read it again, and then again. She held the flashlight so close to the wood that the warmth of the bulb was almost touching the surface, and she read it a third time. And there was no question, no alternate reading, no other set of initials in the world that made any sense at all in this place. Her grandmother had been here. Her grandmother had known about this place, had known about it for 36 years since 1967, and had never mentioned it once, not in 12 years of hallway lamps and morning tea and old songs without names, and the same words said every night at the bedroom door. This will always be yours. Alex lowered the flashlight slowly. She stood in the dark of the old mail car in the Vermont woods with the rain on the roof, and her sister wrapped in burgundy curtains, and the sound of her own breathing, the only human sound in a very large silence. And she understood something that she could not yet have put into words. They had not stumbled into this forest. They had gone to the forest behind the house that Edna Calloway had lived in her entire life, and they had found exactly what was here to be found. Not luck, not accident, something more deliberate than either of those things. Her grandmother had known this place was here, had marked it decades ago with her initials in a promise. The question was what the promise meant, and what had been left here to keep it. She turned around. She needed to find the stove. It took her 4 minutes. Cast iron, small, tucked in the corner near the broken window, its door half open, and its interior black with old ash. A wood stove of the portable kind they used on work trains, designed to keep postal workers warm on mountain routes in the deep of winter. She opened the door fully and shone the light inside. Dry. The ash was old and powdery and sealed the bottom in a thin layer, but the firebox itself was dry and intact. She went back outside. The rain had thinned to a near mist. She worked quickly, pulling dead branches from beneath the canopy of the nearest pines where they had stayed mostly sheltered, snapping them to length across her knee with the efficient movements of someone who had done this before, carrying them back to the car in armloads. 3 trips. On the second trip, she found a birch log fallen against a rock and dried through to its center, and she split it against the edge of the car's steel frame until it came apart in rough, usable sections. She set the fire the way her grandmother had taught her. Small first always. Tinder from the dry pages of an old postal receipt she found on the shelf paper, so old and dry, it had gone yellow and brittle as late autumn leaf. Then fine branches, no thicker than her finger, placed in a small lean over the tinder. Then the heavier wood in a structure above that, waiting for the heat to rise to it. The first match died. She had cupped her hand wrong against a draft she hadn't felt. The second match she held inside the firebox itself, sheltered by cast iron on 3 sides, and the paper caught with a sound like a small decision being made. And then the fine wood caught, and she fed it the way her grandmother had taught her, slowly, without rushing it, because fire is patient if you let it be, and impatient if you push it. Within 4 minutes, the stove was producing heat. Emmy had been watching from across the car, still wrapped in the curtain, her eyes following every movement. When the glow from the stove door reached her face, she moved toward it without being told, and sat down on the floor in front of it, cross-legged, with her hands stretched toward the warmth. Her expression, the expression of someone receiving something they had not been sure was coming. The orange light filled the old car. It caught the edges of the wooden shelves and the canvas mail sacks and the cracked windows and all the accumulated silence of decades, and turned it into something that looked, in the particular and unrepeatable mercy of firelight, almost like shelter. Emmy looked at the stove for a long time. Then she said, quietly, without drama, "It feels like Grandma's house." Alex sat down beside her on the floor. She didn't trust herself to speak for a long moment, so she didn't speak. She sat with her back against the sorting counter and her shoulder against Emmy's shoulder, and watched the fire through the half-open stove door and let the warmth reach her. Outside, the Vermont woods received the last of the night's rain without concern. The pines dripped in their methodical way. The old tracks ran their rusted lines into the dark in both directions, going nowhere that still existed. The mail car sat where it had sat for 32 years, iron and wood and faded green paint, in the particular patience of things that have been placed somewhere on purpose and told to wait. Inside, the stove built its warmth slowly into every corner. When Emmy finally fell asleep, curled on her side on a folded mail sack, with the burgundy curtain pulled over her like a blanket, Alex did not sleep. She sat with her back against the sorting counter and watched the fire, and thought about the carved initials on the wall, and the man's voice on Lorraine Dreyer's phone, and the word that kept returning above all the other words: waiting. Clifton Dreyer had said he'd been waiting for the Calloway land since 1967. The same year someone had carved EC into the wall of this car. The same year, apparently, that the land had become something worth waiting for. Those two facts pointed at each other across 36 years like two ends of a line, and somewhere in the middle of that line was something Alex didn't yet understand but intended to. She was 12 years old. She had $3.40 a box of matches, now missing 2 half a loaf of bread going stale, in a canvas backpack, and a sleeping 7-year-old who trusted her completely. But she had a stove that worked, and a roof that held, and walls that kept the wind out. And she had the beginning of a question. What had her grandmother hidden here in 1967, and why had she never said a word? She fed the stove a length of birch and watched the flame accept it. Through the cracked window, the sky was showing the first gray distinction between dark and less dark that meant morning was working its way toward them from somewhere beyond the clouds. Alex pulled her knees to her chest, rested her chin on them, and kept watch. The forest outside was silent now, in the way it had been silent for 32 years, keeping something waiting for the right person to come and claim it. Morning arrived in the mail car the way it always did in deep forest. Not all at once, but in careful increments, thin gray light filtering through the pine canopy and finding the cracks in the newspaper she hadn't yet stuffed into the windows, laying itself across the warped floor in pale strips that moved slowly as the earth turned. Alex had not slept. She had fed the stove through the remaining hours of the night in small, deliberate increments, the way her grandmother had taught her to manage a fire that needed to last. Not too much at once, not too little. The balance that keeps heat steady without burning through your wood supply before the cold is done with you. Emmy woke at nearly 8. She woke the way she did after hard nights, not abruptly, but in stages. Each stage a small negotiation between sleep and wakefulness. Her eyes opened first, taking in the car's wooden ceiling. Then her hands moved, finding the texture of the curtain she'd slept under. Then the rest of her caught up, and she lay still for a moment, looking at the car around her with the clear eyes of a child who has not yet decided how to feel about where she is. Then she looked at Alex, and something in her face settled into a careful, quiet attentiveness. Not fear exactly, but the watchful stillness of someone who understands that what comes next matters. Alex moved first. "Come on," she said. "I found things while you were sleeping. I'll show you." She took Emmy to the far end of the car and showed her the sorting slots built into the counter, each one stenciled with a town name in faded letters. Barre, Montpelier, St. Johnsbury, White River Junction. A map of Vermont in miniature built into a wooden counter for a different kind of moving through the world. She showed her the old postal receipts stacked in rubber-banded bundles on the high shelf, the dates on them going back to 1958. She showed her the vines growing up the outside wall, visible through the gap where the broken window had been, the way the forest had been, slowly and patiently incorporating the car into itself for 3 decades. Emmy touched the stenciled town names with one careful finger. "They used to put letters in here." "Sorted them," Alex said, while the train was moving. So by the time they got to the station, everything was already organized by where it needed to go. Emmy considered this with the seriousness she applied to most things. "That's smart," she said. "It is," Alex agreed. They ate bread and one of the apples for breakfast sitting near the stove, which Alex had banked to a low and steady heat. The apple was soft and going brown at the edges, but Emmy ate her half without comment, focused and methodical. Afterwards, she began to explore the car with the concentrated attention she brought to any new environment, opening things and closing them, looking into corners, running her hands along the wooden shelves with an expression of professional assessment. Alex watched her sister and thought practically. Water was the first problem. There was a creek somewhere to the northeast. She had heard it during the night walk, in its sound running parallel to their route rather than crossing it, which meant it was close and navigable. She found a metal bucket under the collapsed end of the far shelf, rusted on the outside, but structurally intact, and she worked a section of mail sack into the bottom of it as a liner and took it to the creek, which was exactly where she'd estimated, running clear and cold over smooth, pale stones in a channel a dozen feet wide. She filled the bucket and brought it back and set it on the flat top of the stove to take the edge off the cold. The structure itself was sounder than it had appeared in the dark. The roof had a slight sag at the eastern end, but the steel sheeting was riveted in overlapping layers and held. The floor was warped but unbroken. The walls had gaps where the paneling had pulled from the frame at the joints, but these were fixable. She sealed the worst of them with rolled mail sacks through the first morning, and the wind stayed out. She spent those first hours making the car livable in the specific, deliberate way of someone who intends to stay rather than merely shelter. Old newspaper editions from the 1960s, their pages brown and fragile as dry leaves went into the window gaps, leaving only the least cracked panes to admit light. Empty wooden crates from beneath the sorting counter went against the coldest wall, creating a layer of dead air between the car's occupants and the steel. 6 mail sacks that were still structurally intact, she filled with dry pine needles gathered from beneath the car's overhanging roof, packing them until they were firm and low beds, rough but insulated, far better than bare floor. Emmy claimed a corner beside the stove and announced it was the kitchen. She said this with the seriousness of a proprietor, and Alex did not argue. She found a bent metal cup and established it on the stove's flat top, and it became a kettle of sorts, the water inside it steaming by mid-morning. By early afternoon, the car felt different. Not comfortable by any civilized standard, but purposeful, occupied. The difference between a place that has been found and a place that has been made. That evening, Alex discovered the orchard. She had gone out for more firewood and pushed further than her usual range, following the line of the old tracks west, where they curved around the base of a long ridge. The ridge itself was thick with pines, but where the slope eased at its foot, the trees thinned unexpectedly, and she stepped into a clearing she had not anticipated. The apple trees were old, 30 or 40 years of untended growth, their trunks thicker than her forearm, their branches grown out in the gnarled and generous way of trees that have been left to do as they like and have enjoyed the freedom. The apples were small and mottled and past their best by several weeks, but they were there. Dozens of them still on the branches, more on the ground beneath, going soft in the leaves but not yet gone, wild and uncurated and entirely real. Beyond the apple trees following the base of the ridge, blackberry canes had overgrown themselves into a wall 8 feet high, the berries mostly taken by birds, but some sheltered clusters still holding in the deeper tangles. And inside a collapsed wooden shed at the ridge's base roof, caved walls leaning at the angle of things that had been fighting their own weight for years, a burlap sack of walnuts tied at the top dry and intact, as if someone had stored them there and simply never come back. She carried what she could back to the car, her arms full, and stood in the doorway and held up an apple. And Emmy's face changed, completely open like a window being raised. They roasted the apples on the stove that night, split and placed directly on the iron top. And the smell that rose through the old car was one of the best smells Alex had encountered in her life. Brown sugar and steam and something caramel and warm that seemed to press against the wooden walls and make the whole interior feel larger than its dimensions. Emmy ate slowly, her legs crossed, eyes closed on the first bite. Then she opened her eyes and said, "Do you think the forest wanted us to find this place?" Alex looked through the open door at the dark pines outside. The wind moved through them with a sound like water, not threatening anymore, almost purposeful, the way it sometimes sounded when you stopped being afraid of it and listened to what it was actually doing. She had been thinking about the carved initials all day, fitting them against everything she knew about her grandmother, which was considerable, and against everything she'd heard through Lorraine Dreyer's car window, which was less but more urgent. The two things connected somewhere, she was certain of it, the way two rivers connect even when you can't see the junction from where you're standing. You know it because the water from both of them has to go somewhere. Maybe, she finally said. On the fourth day, it got cold enough that she could see her breath inside the car, even with the stove going. She added another layer of newspaper to the windows and dragged in a section of bark stripped from a fallen pine to cover the worst of the floor gaps. She was outside gathering wood when she noticed Emmy was no longer at the door where she'd been 5 minutes before. She found her sister in the corner. Emmy had started calling the library, the spot where the oldest mail sacks had been piled, the ones too deteriorated for bedding. Emmy had pulled them apart at their seams and was going through their contents with the methodical focus she usually applied to drawing. She held up a bundle of letters still in their envelopes. The rubber band, long since crumbled, held together now by nothing but their own weight and the cohesion of age. Mail that had never been delivered. "Can we read them?" Emmy asked. "They're not ours," Alex said automatically, and then stopped because she wasn't certain that was still true. The sense of what was and wasn't theirs had become complicated in the past 4 days. She sat down beside her sister and picked up one of the envelopes. The address was handwritten in ink that had gone brown with age. The stamp was a 1-cent Lincoln, which meant very old. The cancellation mark was smeared but readable October 1943. She set it down carefully. 60 years. These were letters people had written during the war to people who had been waiting for them, and they had ended up here instead of wherever they were going, and the people on both ends had likely spent years not knowing why the letter never came. 60 years of not knowing, sealed in an envelope and sitting in the corner of a forgotten mail car. She thought about her grandmother keeping this place secret for 36 years, felt a smaller version of the same weight. On the fifth day, Emmy woke with a fever. Alex knew before she touched her forehead, because she knew Emmy's breathing had known every variation of it since Emmy was an infant and Alex was 5, and had appointed herself the unofficial monitor of the baby in the crib, learning its sounds the way some children learn to read by patient attention over time. The breathing was wrong, shallow and fast and slightly ragged at the top of each inhale, catching where it should flow. She touched Emmy's forehead and pulled her hand back. Emmy looked at her with the particular expression of sick children, slightly ashamed of it, as if being ill were a failure of some kind. "My throat hurts," she said. Alex kept her voice level and her face calm. "Okay," she said. "You're going to stay right here and stay warm. I'm going to find you something." She layered everything available over Emmy, both curtains, both intact mail sacks, her own jacket. She built the fire higher than she usually kept it enough to maintain real heat without attention for an hour. She took stock of what she knew about the surrounding area. There had been a house. She had seen it 2 days ago from the edge of the orchard, just visible through the tree line, a roof line, a chimney with smoke coming from it, in a steady column, a light in a window in the early evening. Half a mile at most if she went straight through. She did not want to be seen. She did not want to be reported. But Emmy's fever was real, and she had nothing to give her, and she knew enough about how fevers moved in children. Her grandmother had been careful and practical about such things, had taught her to respect what a fever could become, if you let it run, to understand that doing nothing was a choice she could not make, and still consider herself worthy of the trust Emmy had placed entirely in her. She went. The house was smaller than its roofline had suggested, a one-story structure, built low against the hill, the way old Vermont farmhouses are, as if hunkered down against the long winter, having long since made its accommodation with the season. A woodpile as long as the house itself ran along the south wall, stacked with the precision of someone who has done this for decades. A rusted pickup sat in the yard. Smoke rose from the chimney in a thin, steady line. She knocked. The man who opened the door was somewhere in his 70s, long and spare, with the kind of hands that come from decades of outdoor work, thick-knuckled and deliberate. He had gray eyes and a beard that was white at its center and gray at its edges, and he looked at Alex without surprise, which surprised her more than surprise would have. He looked at her for a moment, and then he said, "You're the girl from the woods." Alex said nothing. He said, "I've seen your smoke. 3 or 4 days now, coming up from the direction of the old rail spur." He looked past her toward the tree line. "One of you or two," Alex said. "My sister's sick. She needs something for fever. I'm not asking for anything else." He studied her face for a moment with the attentiveness of someone making a decision they intend to stand behind. Then he stepped back from the door. "Come in," he said. "I'll find you what you need." His name was August Pruitt. He had lived on this land his entire life, the same as his father before him, and his house had the quality that houses have, when they have been inhabited by the same sensibility for generations. Everything worn to the exact shape of its use, nothing present without reason. A particular order that was not tidiness but intention accumulated over time. He moved through it with the ease of a man who has long since stopped being conscious of his own furniture. He found a bottle of children's acetaminophen in a bathroom cabinet, still sealed, not expired, and set it on the kitchen table along with a clean cloth and a bar of soap without being asked. He put a kettle on the stove and got down 2 mugs with the unhurried movements of someone for whom hospitality is not a performance, but a practice. Alex stood near the door with her hand on the frame and watched him. He said without turning around, "How long have you been out there?" "5 days," Alex said. He nodded like this confirmed what he had already calculated. The kettle began its preliminary sounds. She said, "How do you know about the rail spur?" He was quiet for a moment. Then he turned around, set both mugs on the table, and looked at her directly in the way of a man who has been waiting a long time to say something and is now choosing his words with the care the moment deserves. "My father worked for the Postal Service," he said. 30 years. Ran the mail car on the Montpellier line from 1948 until they discontinued the route in 1971. He paused. "That mail car on the spur, I know exactly which one it is." Alex felt something shift in her chest. She sat down at the table without fully deciding to. "August." Pruitt poured the tea and sat across from her and put both hands around his mug and was quiet for a moment in the way of people who are organizing not just their words, but the weight behind them. "The car was decommissioned in 1971, he said. "Should have gone to the depot in St. Albans to be broken up for scrap. Standard procedure." He looked at his tea. "It didn't go to St. Albans." Alex waited. "Someone arranged for it to stay where it was," he said. Quietly. "No official record of the spur track, no official record of the car on the county rail maps after 71. Just removed from the record, as if it had never been there." He looked up at her. "My father knew who arranged it. He helped arrange it, I think, though he never said so plainly. He only ever told me that the car on the spur belonged to a woman in Millhaven, that it was hers by rights and would stay hers as long as she needed it to." Alex's hands tightened around the mug. A woman in Millhaven. August's gray eyes were steady. "He said your grandmother's name was Edna Calloway." It wasn't a question. Alex stared at him. "He said I heard she passed. Word moves through small places, even out here." He looked down at the table. "I'm sorry for it. She was a private person, but a good one. My father spoke of her with a great deal of respect." He paused. "She and my father were friends for a long time, from before I was born. He was the one who helped her with the car. She asked him to in 1967, and he did it because she needed it done, and he trusted her reasons even when she didn't explain them fully to him." Alex said, "Why didn't she explain them?" August Pruitt looked at her with an expression that lived somewhere between sadness and something more complicated. "Because there are things people keep close to protect the people they love," he said. "And Edna Calloway understood a great deal about protecting the people she loved, even when those people didn't yet know they needed it." Alex absorbed this slowly. She looked at the acetaminophen on the table. She thought about 5 days in the mail car and the carved initials on the wall and Clifton Dryer's voice saying the land is finally clear. She thought about a woman who had lived in the same house her entire life and had never once mentioned a mail car in the forest behind it. She said, "There's something under the floor of that car, isn't there?" August Pruitt looked at her for a long moment without speaking. Then he picked up his mug and drank from it slowly and set it down again. "Check under the floorboards," he said. "That's all I'll say. The rest is yours to find." Alex stood up. She took the acetaminophen and the cloth and the soap and paused at the door. She said, "Why won't you just tell me what's there?" He looked at her from across the kitchen with his large, worn hands around the mug and his gray eyes that had the quality of eyes that have looked at hard weather for a long time and found a way to keep looking. "Because it was put there for you," he said. "Not for me. She put it there for the person who came looking. You came looking. Whatever you find, you'll know what to do with it because she chose you to find it." He paused. "One more thing," he said. "There's a man named Clifton Dryer who has been trying to acquire land on the western edge of Millhaven for the better part of 15 years. His voice was careful and level. He's been looking at a particular parcel that runs from the road down through the forest to the ridge." Alex felt the air in the room change. August continued, "He's a patient man, which makes him the most dangerous kind. Get back to your sister and check under the floor." She walked back through the forest faster than she had come. Emmy was flushed but awake, sitting up against the sorting counter with the burgundy curtain around her shoulders. Alex dissolved half a tablet in the warmed water in the bent cup and made her drink it slowly and then made her lie back down and held her hand until the flush began to ease and Emmy's eyes went heavy and stayed that way. Then Alex got up and looked at the floor. She had noticed the board 4 days ago without consciously registering it, one plank near the center of the car, sitting slightly higher than its neighbors on one side, the grain running at a fractionally different angle, as if it had been lifted and carefully replaced rather than laid in place once and left. She had recorded it without filing it, which was the way her mind worked with things it didn't yet have a category for. It was there now in the category it belonged in. She crouched beside it and pressed her fingers to the higher edge. It moved. Not dramatically a millimeter, perhaps two, but it moved with the particular give of something that has been designed to move. Not warped by age, not settled by weather. Fitted, deliberately placed and deliberately made to be lifted. She needed something thin and rigid to work the edge. She found a piece of metal banding on the broken shelving, the kind used to secure stacked shipping crates for rail transport, flat and narrow and strong, and she worked it into the gap at the board's edge and levered slowly, and the board came up with a sound that was less a creak than a long exhale, as if it had been holding its breath for 36 years and was finally permitted to release it. Beneath it, darkness, the smell of sealed dry air, and the cold glint of metal. Alex reached in. Her fingers found a box. Not large, roughly the size of a shoebox, perhaps slightly deeper, with the weight of something that has been made to protect its contents rather than merely contain them. She lifted it out and set it on the floor and felt the density of it, not the weight of gold or cash, but the particular solid weight of documents of things recorded and preserved. The lid fit tightly sealed around its edge, with a bead of rubber gasket material that had hardened and cracked with age but had held. She worked her fingernails under the edge and peeled it back in sections and opened the box. 3 things. A document folded into quarters, the paper cream-colored and heavy in the way of legal instruments, paper made to outlast the people who signed it. She unfolded it carefully. The text was formal and dense, and she read it twice before the keywords arranged themselves into meaning. Grantor grantee property described as follows: Millhaven County, Vermont, to be held in perpetuity by Edna Ruth Calloway and her lawful descendants. A deed. The deed to the land that Clifton Dryer had been waiting for since 1967. The second item was a sheet of paper wrapped around the third item and secured with a piece of twine that had dried to the color of old straw. Alex unwrapped it. Her grandmother's handwriting, she recognized it in the first instant, the way you recognize a voice before you've consciously heard it. The particular slant of the letters, the way the E's close fully and the L's loop back on themselves. It was not long, half a page. She read it standing in the afternoon light coming through the newspaper-stuffed windows. For Alexandra, when the time comes. If you found this, the forest brought you home the way I always hoped it would. I kept this place because I knew there might come a day when you needed somewhere that was truly yours. I kept the deed because I knew there might come a day when someone tried to take what belongs to this family. That day is probably why you're here. This land has belonged to Calloway women since before you were born. The deed is legal and registered with the county clerk in 1967. No one can take it from you as long as you hold this document and know what it means. Don't give it to anyone. Don't let anyone tell you it isn't real. Find someone honest and show them what you have. I love you more than any word in the English language was built to hold. Fight for this. Your grandmother, Edna. Alex read it once. Then she read it again slowly, each line at its own pace. Then she folded it along the same creases her grandmother had made, those precise folds that had held for however long the box had sat beneath the floor. Because those creases were the last physical thing Edna Calloway had made before she closed this box and replaced this board and walked back to her house on Millhaven Road and went on living her ordinary life with this extraordinary thing hidden and waiting in the forest behind it. She held the folded letter with both hands for a moment. She did not cry. She had learned from her grandmother by long observation that some things are too large for tears and require instead a very particular kind of stillness. The stillness of someone who is holding something important and knows it and understands that falling apart is a luxury you earn after the work is done. She set the letter down carefully. Then she looked at the third item, which the letter had been wrapped around a bundle of envelopes, 6 of them bound together with the same dried twine. These were different from the old wartime correspondence in the sorting sacks. The paper was still off-white rather than brown. The ink was still clearly black. The stamps were from the late 1960s and early 1970s. The address on each one was her grandmother's address on Millhaven Road. Return address, Raymond Galt, a street in Bar, Vermont. The postmarks ranged from October 1968 to March 1971. 5 of the envelopes had been through the mail, stamped and postmarked, and presumably delivered. The 6th was different. No stamp, no postmark. The envelope unsealed and folded once, the way you fold something you intend to leave in a place rather than send through a system. Left by hand for someone who would know to look. 6 letters from a man named Raymond Galt to Edna Calloway, all unopened, all here. Alex sat down on the floor beside the metal box and held the bundle, and understood that she was sitting at the center of something that had been larger and longer than her own life. Something set in motion before she existed, tended by people who had known her grandmother in ways she was only now beginning to understand. Her grandmother had spent 36 years making sure she would arrive at exactly this position, in possession of what she needed in a place that was safe. With the tools to act, she set the bundle carefully back in the box. She put the deed on top of it, and the letter on top of the deed, and closed the lid, and placed the box in the deepest corner of the car behind the stacked crates where no casual glance would reach it. Then she went and added wood to the stove and sat beside her sleeping sister and thought. Clifton Dryer had said the land would come clear in 6 to 8 weeks. He had said he'd been waiting since 1967. The deed had been registered in 1967. He had known about the deed and had been waiting, as August Pruitt had said, with the patience of a dangerous man for a moment when there was no one left who could say, "This is ours, and here is the proof." He had believed that moment had arrived. He had believed it because Lorraine had removed the girls and the house would go into probate and there would be no Calloway left standing. But there was. There was a 12-year-old girl in a Vermont mail car with a deed in a metal box and a dead woman's instruction to fight, and Clifton Dryer knew nothing about any of it. That was the only advantage she had. She needed to understand exactly how much it was worth before she decided what to do with it. Emmy stirred. She opened her eyes with the clear, steady gaze of someone whose fever has broken and who is very hungry. "Is there more apple?" she asked. Something in Alex's chest released that she hadn't known was held. "Yes," she said, "there's more apple." She got up to find it, and the stove held its warmth against the October cold. And outside, the forest stood in its patient way around the old mail car as it had stood for 32 years, and the afternoon light moved slowly through the pines toward evening. The 6 letters from Raymond Galt sat in the metal box for 2 more days before Alex opened them. She had reasons for the delay. Emmy needed tending. The fever had broken cleanly, but left her tired and quieter than usual, content to sit near the stove, drawing on the blank backs of old postal receipts with a pencil stub Alex had found wedged between 2 floor planks. The firewood supply needed rebuilding after she'd burned through more than planned during the fever days. And there was the larger problem. She'd been turning over the problem of what a 12-year-old girl in the woods was supposed to do next with a property deed, and the knowledge that a man named Clifton Dryer was in the process of committing fraud. But the real reason she waited was simpler than any of that. She knew that once she opened those letters, she would understand more than she currently did. And understanding more would make it impossible to stay still. She needed to be sure of the ground beneath her before she stepped out onto it. On the 7th morning, she opened the first letter. Raymond Galt wrote the way people wrote when letters were the primary means of communicating important things, carefully, with the assumption that each word would be read more than once, with the handwriting of a man who had spent his working life making small legible marks in small designated spaces. Precise, intentional. The first letter was dated October 1968. Mostly practical, confirming that the deed had been filed with the county clerk's office on September 14, 1967, as agreed between them. confirming that Raymond had retained a copy himself secured separately as discussed. He mentioned that a representative from a development company out of Burlington had come around asking questions about the parcel, and that Raymond had told him nothing because there was nothing he was obligated to share. The deed is clean and registered, he wrote. As long as you hold your copy and I hold mine, the land belongs to you and yours regardless of what anyone attempts to arrange otherwise. Keep your copy somewhere they will not think to look. The second letter, June 1969. The tone had shifted, less practical, more urgent, in the measured way of someone trying not to alarm, while unable to pretend that calm was entirely warranted. The man from Burlington had returned, not alone. Raymond wrote that he had now heard the name Dreyer attached to the development interest of family operation, father and son, the son the more aggressive of the two. I think they know the deed exists, he wrote. I don't know how they found out, but persistent men have ways of finding out things. Be careful, Edna. Keep your copy where it is. Don't let anyone convince you that a verbal agreement or county reassessment supersedes a registered deed, because it does not, regardless of what anyone tells you. The third letter, September 1970. Shorter. Raymond explained that he was keeping letters brief because he had reason to believe his correspondence was being monitored. He acknowledged this sounded like the concern of an overwrought man, but said he stood by it. Your copy is secure, he wrote. Don't move it. Don't tell anyone where it is. If something happens to me, my son August knows enough to help the right person find what they need, though I have not burdened him with the full particulars. Alex stopped. August knows enough. She sat with that for a moment. August Pruitt at his kitchen table saying, check under the floorboards, that's all I'll say. Saying it with the manner of a man releasing an obligation he had carried for a very long time, without knowing precisely when he would need to fulfill it or for whom. His father had written those words in 1970. 33 years later, the son had honored them not by acting himself, but by pointing the right direction and stepping back. Exactly as Raymond Galt had intended. She read the remaining three letters. The fourth was brief and cautious. Raymond had heard that the county was being approached about reclassifying certain unregistered parcels, and he wanted Edna to know that a deed properly registered in 1967 was protected from reclassification absent fraud in the original filing, which there was not. The fifth, from early 1971, reported that the development interest appeared to have gone quiet and that Raymond believed they had moved on to other targets, though he remained watchful. The sixth letter was the last, dated March 1971, 2 months before the mail route was discontinued and Raymond retired. It was different from the others, no stamp, no postmark. The envelope unsealed, folded once. Raymond had placed it here by hand in the car, rather than trusting it to the mail. It said, I am leaving this letter in the car, rather than posting it, because I want everything to be in one place for whoever comes looking. The deed is yours. The land is yours. I have done everything within my power to make sure of it. The Dreyer family has not given up men like that. Do not give up, they only wait. But the law is clear and the document is registered. And as long as a Callaway holds that deed, they have nothing. Keep it safe. Keep it secret if you can. And if a day comes when you can no longer keep it secret, fight for it with everything you have. It is worth fighting for. He had signed it, your friend as always. R.G. Alex sat for a long time with the last letter in her hands. Then she put all 6 back in their bundle, retied them with the dried twine, and replaced everything in the metal box. The deed, her grandmother's letter, Raymond's letters, and closed the lid and set the box in its corner. She went outside and sat on the iron steps and looked at the forest. The problem was clear enough. A deed was only as powerful as the person holding it and the institution willing to recognize it. She was 12 years old and a runaway with no guardian and no official standing. If she walked into a county office with a property deed and said someone is committing fraud, the first response would be to ask where her parents were and why she wasn't in school. And the moment she was identified, she was one phone call away from Lorraine Dreyer. She needed to understand exactly what Clifton Dreyer was doing and what it looked like in the public record before she did anything. Not what she believed or what August had implied. What was actually there, documented, verifiable by anyone who looked. The public library in Harwick was 4 miles from the forest edge. She had passed the Harwick sign with her grandmother twice a year on the bus into town. She knew the library was on Main Street. Her grandmother had taken her there once when Alex was 9, and they had spent an afternoon looking at survey maps of Vermont from the 1800s, and her grandmother had shown her how to read the scale and trace the property lines. She told Emmy she would be back by dark. She made her eat 2 apples and half the remaining walnuts first. She showed her how to feed the stove small pieces, not too often enough to keep the heat steady. Emmy listened with the focused gravity she brought to things that mattered. The walk to the forest edge took 40 minutes. She emerged onto a dirt road oriented by sun position and traffic sounds from the paved road to the south, and from there she knew the route. She walked with her hands in her pockets and her head at the angle of a child who is going somewhere she's supposed to be going and has no reason to look at anyone. The library opened at 9. She arrived at 1:15. The librarian at the desk was an older woman with reading glasses on a beaded chain and the efficient warmth of someone who has been answering questions for many years and considers it a vocation worth having. She looked at Alex over the glasses. "Can I help you find something? I need to look up property records for Millhaven County," Alex said. "Land deeds and recent filing activity. Is that something I can do here?" The librarian studied her for a moment. Then she said, "We have access to the county assessor's database through the public terminal in the back. Updated weekly, second computer on the left." Alex sat down and navigated to the county assessor's database. The interface was designed by someone who believed that public information should require effort to access, but she was patient and methodical, and after 11 minutes, she found what she was looking for. The Callaway land, listed under Edna Ruth Callaway. Original deed registered September 14, 1967. She clicked through to the filing history. There was a new entry, filed 6 days ago, 4 days after Edna Callaway's death. A deed transfer application. Grantor Edna Ruth Callaway. Grantee Dreyer Development, LLC. Filed by Lorraine M. Dreyer, authorized agent. The date on the transfer document was September 28th. Alex opened a second tab and found the death certificate record. Edna Ruth Callaway. Date of death, October 1st. She sat very still. The transfer was dated 3 days before her grandmother died. Edna Callaway had supposedly signed her land over to Clifton Dreyer's company 3 days before her heart stopped in the kitchen while she was slicing an apple. She had supposedly, of her own free will, transferred the property she had protected for 36 years. The property she had hidden a deed to in a sealed metal box under the floor of a forgotten mail car 3 days before she died. It was a forgery. It could not be anything else. Alex sat at the public library terminal and looked at a fraudulent deed transfer filed by Lorraine Dreyer on behalf of her husband, and she felt something that was not quite anger and not quite grief, something cleaner and more useful than either, something that sharpened rather than burned. She printed 4 pages, the fraudulent transfer, the original 1967 registration record, the death certificate, the county's own registration record showing the original deed's filing date and notary seal. 10 cents per page. She had $3.40. She printed them all. She found the county's process for reporting suspected deed fraud on the assessor's website. There was a form. It could be submitted anonymously to the county inspector's office, a separate office from the recorder of deeds operating under state attorney general oversight specifically for situations like this. She printed the form, 10 more cents. She took it to the study table in the corner and filled it out in her grandmother's insisted upon handwriting letters, form completely no shortcuts. Nothing that could be misread. She described the database findings. She noted the date discrepancy transfer, filed September 28th, death certificate dated October 1st. She noted the continuous registration of the original 1967 deed in the county record. She noted that the authorized agent on the fraudulent filing, Lorraine M. Dreyer, was employed by Millhaven County as a social services officer and had been the officer dispatched to the Calloway residence on the night of Edna Calloway's death, creating a direct and material conflict of interest. She wrote it in plain declarative sentences, facts in order, the order that made the conclusion unavoidable. She did not sign her name. She printed anonymous in the signature line, which the form indicated was a permitted option for fraud complaints. She walked 4 blocks to the municipal building. She did not go inside. She found the mail slot beside the main entrance, official correspondence metal flap, and she folded the completed form around the 4 printed pages and pushed the packet through the slot and listened to it land on the other side. Then she put her hands back in her pockets and walked toward the forest. She moved faster on the return, not running but close to it. The light was already going gold in the October way, dropping fast toward the short days of the season. She had told Emmy she'd be back by dark. She entered the tree line and felt the temperature change as the canopy closed over her and followed the creek sound back to the tracks and the tracks east to the car. Emmy was sitting on the iron steps when she came through the pines. The stove was going at exactly the right level. She had drawn 4 pictures on postal receipts and lined them up on the sorting counter with the seriousness of a gallery curator. "You were gone a long time," Emmy said. "I know. Sorry." Alex climbed the steps and stood in the doorway and looked at the pictures. "Are these for the library?" Emmy considered. "Yes," she said, "for the wall above the library." Alex looked at them one by one. The forest at night, dark triangular trees and a small orange rectangle with light in its windows. Emmy herself sitting by the stove. An apple tree in a clearing, round and generous, the way Emmy had decided happy apple trees looked. The fourth was Edna, white hair, blue dress, the shape more impression than accuracy, but unmistakably entirely her. Alex looked at the 4th picture for a long moment without speaking. "Grandma would have liked this place," Emmy said, simply, not as a question. "Yeah," Alex said, "she already did." Emmy looked up at her with the expression of a child assembling a new understanding, placing a piece she hadn't expected to find. "Already? How do you know?" "Because she put us here," Alex said. "She planned for us to find it." Emmy absorbed this in her methodical way. She looked at the drawing of the car in the forest, the small orange light in the dark. Then she looked back at her sister. "Did you do something today?" "Something important." Alex looked at the forest behind them, the pines standing in their long lines, the last light finding its way between the trunks and flat golden beams. She thought about the packet in the mail slot, and the facts arranged in their order, and whoever would open it in the morning. "I started something," Alex said. "I don't know yet if it was enough." 3 days later, August Pruitt came through the forest. She heard him before she saw him. The deliberate, unhurried sound of someone who knows how to move through woods. Branches held and released rather than pushed through footsteps placed with attention to what was under them. He appeared at the edge of the rail clearing and raised one hand when he saw Alex in the doorway, half greeting, half signal that he was alone and there was nothing to alarm. He had brought a cloth bag, dried beans, 2 tins of soup, a bar of soap, and another bottle of children's pain reliever. He handed it to Alex without ceremony and stood outside until she stepped back from the door. "Come in," she said. He ducked through this doorway and looked around the car with the slow attention of someone measuring what a place has become against what it was. He looked at Emmy's gallery above the sorting counter. He looked at the newspaper windows and the stacked crates and the mail sack beds. He looked at the stove and the cup on its flat top. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said my father would have been glad to see it this way. Emmy, who had determined August was trustworthy on the basis of the supplies, showed him the pictures. He examined each one with appropriate seriousness. He said the apple tree was very accurate. Emmy said I've never actually seen it up close. He said you'll want to go look before the season's done. 2 or 3 of them will still have good fruit if the deer haven't gotten to them first. He drank tea from the second bent cup and told Alex what he'd heard. He had been in Harwick 2 days ago. The clerk at the assessor's office, a woman he'd known for 30 years, had told him not as gossip, but as information she thought he'd want, that the inspector's office had received an anonymous fraud complaint regarding a deed transfer in Millhaven. They're taking it seriously, he said. The date discrepancy is plain enough on its face that ignoring it would make them part of the problem. He looked at his tea. The inspector's office forwarded the matter to the state attorney general. That's not routine. That means it's outside Clifton Dryer's local reach. Alex watched his face. What does that mean for the land? A hold, he said. While the fraud investigation is open, no transfer can be completed. The land stays in Edna's name and by extension her lawful descendants until the matter resolves. He paused. They'll want to talk to whoever filed the complaint. Anonymity only carries so far in a formal investigation. Alex said, I know. He looked at her steadily. You'll need to show them what you have. The original deed, the letters, everything. I know, she said again. He was quiet for a moment. Then there's more. Lorraine Dryer has been placed on administrative leave pending a conflict of interest review. That was Clifton's first protection gone. He paused longer. Clifton went to the county offices yesterday with his lawyer. He expected to finalize the transfer. He found out about the hold while he was standing at the desk. Alex waited. August set down his mug and looked at her in the particular way he had of looking at things considered not without feeling, but where the feeling had been organized into something more useful than emotion alone. He was not expecting it, August said. He has been running this for a long time and he believed it was finished. He paused. Finding out that a 12-year-old girl in a mail car in the woods had walked into the public library and dismantled his scheme before he reached the finish line was not something he had prepared for. Alex said nothing. August said he'll look for you now. He'll work it backward. He's a patient man with resources, and he'll figure out where the complaint came from. You need to not be in the forest when he does. She had known this was coming. She had known it since she pushed the envelope through the mail slot and started back toward the trees. She looked at Emmy, who was eating beans from the tin with the focused appreciation of a child who has been short on protein for days. I need to go tell them who I am, Alex said. August nodded slowly. Yes, he said. You do. He paused. I'll go with you if you'll allow it. Not to speak for you, to stand beside you. Alex thought about her grandmother's letter. Find someone honest and show them what you have. She looked at August Pruitt and thought about a man named Raymond Galt, who had written 6 letters over 3 years to protect a piece of land for a woman he respected, and whose son had carried that obligation for 30 more years without being asked to and without letting it go. Okay, she said. They went the following morning. Alex carried the metal box in the backpack, the wool blanket wrapped around it for protection. August walked beside her through the forest to the road, and from the road they took his truck, and Alex sat in the front seat with the backpack on her lap and watched Vermont move past the window. Stone walls and bare maples and farmhouses low against their hills, and felt the particular quality of a morning when something set in motion a long time ago is arriving at the place it was always going. The county inspector's office was on the 2nd floor of the municipal building. The woman at the desk looked at them both, at August, tall and deliberate, and at Alex, 12 years old with a canvas backpack and the expression of someone who has made a decision and finished being afraid of it and made a phone call. The inspector was a man named Gerald Foss. He had the manner of someone who had worked in county government long enough to have seen most things, and the particular alertness of a person who had spent 2 days wondering who had filed an anonymous complaint with this level of specificity and organization. He looked at Alex for a moment after she sat down across his desk. Then he said, "The complaint we received. That was you." "Yes," Alex said. He nodded as if this confirmed something rather than surprised him. "How old are you, 12? He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "All right, tell me what you know. Start at the beginning." She told him everything. From the night Edna died to Lorraine Dryer's phone call outside the window to the decision to run. The mail car and the carved initials and the board in the floor and the metal box and Raymond Galt's letters. She opened the backpack and laid the contents on his desk in chronological order. The original deed, her grandmother's letter. The printed pages from the library database. Raymond Galt's letters in their bundle. the sixth letter set slightly apart, still folded in its single fold never stamped, placed by hand. Foss looked at each item carefully without touching them. He looked at them the way people look at things they want to fully understand before they respond. Then he looked at Alex. "Did anyone help you prepare this?" "No," she said. He looked at August. August said she came to me when her sister was sick and needed medicine. I told her to check under the floorboards. Everything after that she did herself. Foss looked back at Alex. She held his gaze. He said the deed is in the county record. I checked it after the complaint came in. The 1967 registration is legitimate. The seal is valid. The notary is on record. He paused. The transfer filed 6 days ago has a signing date that precedes the death certificate by 3 days. That's a material impossibility. A grantor cannot convey title after death, and she demonstrably cannot have signed 3 days before death. The transfer claims no notary present, which is itself irregular. He leaned back. The state attorney general's office is already involved, he said. This will move quickly. He looked at Alex. What you've brought me today, the original deed, the correspondence, the second copy, this substantially strengthens the evidentiary record. He paused and his voice moved from official to human in the way voices do when the facts have been addressed and what remains is the person. He said, "You're going to need a guardian while this is resolved. We cannot leave 2 children living in a mail car in the forest regardless of how well the mail car appears to be managed." Alex had prepared for this. She looked at August. August Pruitt said, "I am willing to serve as temporary guardian if the court will allow it. No criminal record. I own my property free and clear. I've known this family through my father for 50 years. He paused. I believe Edna Calloway would have chosen it this way. Foss looked at him for a moment. Then he picked up his phone. The weeks that followed were the weeks Alex would carry for the rest of her life as the time when everything happened at once and none of it was in her hands, which was both a relief and the hardest thing. The discovery that there are moments when the right thing to do is to have already done everything you could do and then to wait. The state attorney general's investigation moved with the speed of an institution handed a case with clear documentation and a public interest profile, too significant to manage slowly. A county social services officer using her position to facilitate her husband's fraudulent land scheme, targeting the estate of a deceased elderly woman, removing the woman's minor grandchildren from their home in order to clear the estate for acquisition. The story told itself. Lorraine Dreyer was suspended, then terminated. Clifton Dreyer's attorney filed 2 countermotions. Both were denied. A family court judge appointed August Pruitt as temporary guardian within 8 days of the inspector's emergency petition on the basis of his relationship to the family and Gerald Foss's written statement. Alex and Emmy moved into August's house at the edge of the forest. Emmy adapted with the resilience of a child who has already proven she can sleep in a mail car and call it home. She claimed the guest room with the same proprietary certainty she had applied to the car's corners, placed her postal receipt drawings on the walls in a considered arrangement, and asked August if there was a library in the house. He showed her the shelf in the sitting room where his father's books had lived for 40 years, and she sat down in front of it and did not move for 2 hours. Alex helped August split firewood for 3 days. He showed her the rhythm of it, how to read the grain where the wedge goes, how to let the maul do the work. She already knew the fundamentals from her grandmother, but August's approach had small refinements, and she paid attention to the refinements because the fundamentals are where you start and the refinements are where you get better. On the 4th evening, he said, "You split cleaner than most grown men I've worked with." She said, "My grandmother taught me the basics." He said, "You built on them." That's what she would have wanted. She went back to the mail car once a week, sometimes alone, sometimes with Emmy. It was still there. It had been there for 32 years and would outlast her concern about it. But she went anyway, swept the floor, fed the stove, sat on the iron steps for a while looking at the trees. She went the way you visit a place that has done something important for you, which is not entirely rational and does not need to be. 3 weeks after the night they ran, she was sitting on the steps in the cold, clear air of a November afternoon, when she heard Emmy's voice from the direction of the orchard. Emmy came through the pines carrying 4 small apples in the fold of her jacket, walking with the careful gait of a child transporting something that matters. She climbed the steps and sat beside Alex and held out 2 of the apples. August says, if we're still here in spring, we can plant the seeds, Emmy said. He says the orchard used to be bigger before his father stopped tending it. Alex took an apple and turned it in her hand. Small, cold, slightly misshapen, the kind of apple that has grown without being asked to produce anything in particular and has done it anyway. We'll be here in spring, she said. Emmy leaned against her shoulder the way she had always done, her small, solid warmth, as reliable as the cold or the trees or the sound of the creek somewhere beyond the pines. They sat on the iron steps of the old mail car in the November light and ate the apples and didn't need to talk. The investigation concluded in January. The Attorney General's office filed criminal fraud charges against Clifton Dreyer for deed forgery and against Lorraine Dreyer for abuse of official position. Both entered plea negotiations. Neither would hold any position in Millhaven County again in any capacity for any reason. The Callaway land was formally confirmed as the property of Alexandra and Emmy Callaway, held in trust until Alex turned 18, with August Pruitt as trustee and guardian. Gerald Foss called August when the order came through. August told Alex. She was in the kitchen washing dishes when he said it, and she stood with her hands in the warm water and looked out the window at the line of trees at the edge of August's property. The trees that if you walked into them and followed the creek and found the tracks and followed them east, eventually brought you to the clearing and the old car. She didn't speak for a moment. August stood in the doorway and was quiet because he had learned in 3 months that Alex processed important things in silence and that the silence deserved to be left undisturbed. Then she said, "Can I plant apple trees on the land in the spring?" He said, "It's your land." She nodded. She pulled the stopper from the sink and dried her hands on the dish towel hanging from the oven handle, the same position her grandmother had always kept the dish towel, the position of every grandmother's dish towel in every kitchen Alex had ever been in, which seemed less a preference than a universal law. She said, "Raymond Galt protected that land because your father asked him to. Your father protected it because my grandmother asked him to." She paused. "I want to plant something that lasts that long." August looked at her from the doorway. "Apple trees properly tended," he said, "can live 150 years. Alex hung the dish towel back on the handle. "That should be about right," she said. On the last day of November, Alex and Emmy went together to the mail car in the early morning, when the frost was still on the ground and the sky above the pines was the color of a held breath, pale and clear and very cold. Their footsteps on the old rail bed made no sound under the frost-stiff leaves. Alex built the fire the way she always had, small, first, patient, the way her grandmother had taught her. She fed it the way it wanted to be fed, and the stove warmed the car the way it always had, orange and steady and sufficient, and the smell of hot iron and old wood rose through the car the way it had risen through every morning they had spent here. Emmy sat in her corner with a postal receipt in the pencil stub and drew. Alex sat on the step with the door open and looked out at the forest where the low winter light moved between the trunks and long flat beams. Smoke rose from the pipe above the car's roof in a thin gray column that bent east in the light wind and dissolved into the cold, clear air above the pines. She thought about Edna Callaway standing at the hallway lamp every night and saying the same words in the same voice. She thought about Raymond Galt writing 6 letters over 3 years to make sure a piece of land stayed safe for people who hadn't yet been born when the threat first appeared. She thought about August Pruitt carrying his father's instruction for 30 years without knowing exactly when he would need to honor it or for whom. She thought about a 12-year-old girl walking 4 miles to a public library and sitting down at a computer terminal and finding the things she needed to find because she had been raised to pay attention, to notice the details that other people moved past, to trust that the small things were usually the important things and that the important things were worth fighting for. Emmy said from inside Alex, "Come look." She got up and went in. Emmy held up the receipt she'd been working on. It was the mail car rendered in her particular way, more feeling than accuracy, more truth than precision. But the proportions were right this time. And the one detail she had gotten exactly correct was the smoke from the pipe rising and bending and becoming indistinguishable from the sky above the trees. Alex looked at it for a long moment. She said that's the best one yet. Emmy held it at arm's length and examined it critically. I think so too, she said. Then she looked up at her sister. Can we put it on the wall? Alex took the drawing and looked at the wall. The aged wooden paneling, the carved letters still there, as they had been and would be EC. This will always be yours. 1967. She held Emmy's drawing beside the inscription, the two things side by side. The old mark and the new one. 36 years between them and the same claim running through both. She found a bent nail in the corner of the sorting shelf and tapped it into the wood with the flat of a piece of metal banding and hung the drawing directly beneath the carved letters where it caught the light from the stove and moved slightly in the warm air rising from it. She stepped back. Outside, the Vermont forest stood in its late autumn patience around the old mail car. The pines and the sugar maples and the long rusted rails and the creek running cold and clear over its smooth stones somewhere beyond the ridge. A red-tailed hawk crossed the pale sky above the canopy and was gone without a sound. The frost on the leaves of the clearing was beginning to soften in the morning warmth, giving back to the air what the night had taken. Inside, the stove held its fire. Emmy put her pencil behind her ear the way she'd started doing and began a new drawing. Alex sat down on the floor of the mail car that her grandmother had hidden in 1967, and her grandmother's friend had protected for decades, and the forest had held in its patient way through 32 winters, and she leaned her back against the sorting counter and stretched her legs out in front of her and breathed the smell of old wood and iron and wood smoke and the cold air coming in through the cracked window above her. The walls were still standing. The roof still held. The fire still burned. Somewhere beneath the floor where the metal box no longer needed to hide the old pine boards held their warmth the same way they had always held it the same way. All old things hold what they have been trusted to keep. Carefully, quietly, and for exactly as long as it takes.